بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وبعد. So to continue inshallah with al-Muhadhab min Ihya ulumuddin by Hujjatul Islam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, and we reached last week we concluded what we were taking of the a'mal of salah and how we should find ourselves whilst we are engaging in the prayer, the various acts of the prayer. And we have come to al-bab al-rabi' fi al-imamati wal-qudwa. So in this section, Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he's going to speak about al-imama. So al-imama being the one who leads the salah, and al-qudwa. And qudwa is basically the person who is the example, or the taken as an example, taken for the purposes of leadership and so on and so forth. And imama is a type of leadership. So the imama in the masjid, i.e. the one who leads the salah in the masjid, it's referred to as al-imamatu sughra, the lower form of imama. And al-imamatul, the greater type of imama, sometimes you'll hear the ulama or you'll read the fuqaha, they refer to as al-imam, i.e. al-imam al-a'zam. So the imam of the Muslim lands, the sultan, the hakim, the khalifa, etc. And so the imam is representative of his small masjid, big masjid, community. And the concept of the imam is one that needs to be discussed in our time today. And there is a lot that can be said about the position of the imam. And of course, as I am an imam, I'm going to try my best to separate myself from that which we read, so that we can discuss it and we can think about that which is mentioned and talk about it properly, etc. So he says, perhaps if someone is in the office, if they can alter the microphone as it sounds a bit tingy, I guess, it's a tinny sound. He says, وعلى الإمام وظائف he says وعلى الإمام وظائف قبل الصلاة وفي القراءة وفي أركان الصلاة وبعد السلام. He says that upon the imam there are acts, there are responsibilities that he has to consider prior to the prayer, during the prayer, and the arkan, i.e. the integrals of the prayer, and after the salam. So he's going to discuss some of those. He says, al-wadha'if allati qabla as-salah. And so this is what we're going to focus on this evening, inshallah. He says the responsibilities of the imam prior to the prayer. He says, أما الوظائف التي هي قبل الصلاة فست. He says there are 6 things. أولها ألا يتقدم للإمامة على قوم يكرهونه. So he says the first responsibility of the imam, the first point that the imam should consider is that he himself, i.e. the person who is going to step forward for the salah, does not step forward to lead a people who dislike him. Now, this is one that is potentially problematic. Why? Because there are some people who may dislike you for no valid reason. Therefore, the fuqaha, they stipulate بِحَقٍّ يَكْرَهُونَهُ بِحَقٍّ. They have a valid reason to dislike him. He says, فَإِنْ اخْتَلَفُوا كَانَ النَّظْرُ إِلَى الْأَكْثَرِينَ. If the congregation, the community differ about this individual, then you go with the greater in number. Why? Because it's very unlikely that the majority of a people would dislike someone and they are not correct in disliking this person. So usually you will find if the imam is doing his job and taking care of his role properly, usually you will find that the majority of people will take a liking to the person, the imam, and only a few people will have a disliking for him. And usually that goes back to those individuals themselves. There are unfortunately members in most communities that will dislike any imam that you put in front of them because they have issues in themselves. Sometimes one of the biggest reasons for a person to dislike an imam or to dislike the one that's leading him in salah is because he himself wants to be in that position, or he himself sees himself as fit for that position, therefore no one else should have it. And say the same thing about the adhan. Sometimes you will find individuals, they become upset when others call the adhan instead of them. Why? Because they see themselves as having a right to the adhan over others, and so on and so forth. And that's ego. That's an issue of ego. And as for the Imam should not see himself as fit for the place of imamah. The Imam should always see himself as not fit for the place of imamah. It should not be a thing of, I deserve this position, I have a right to this position. If an Imam feels like that, then that's a sign of a problem with the heart. And that's a bad sign. Why? Because he will begin to become complacent, and he will not seek out further development of himself, and so on and so forth. So he says, وكما ينهى عن تقدمه مع كراهيتهم فكذلك ينهى عن التقدم إن كان وراءه من هو أفقه منه. And just as it is, he should not, put himself forward in front of a people who have a dislike for him, with a right to dislike him. So what would be a valid reason to dislike an Imam? It could be, for example, that he can't recite the Quran properly. He cannot recite the Quran properly, meaning when he recites the Quran, he is not reciting with the correct tajweed and the correct pronunciation of the letters. We're not talking about the beautification of the Quran, because many Imams, they beautify the Quran, but they're not reciting correctly, unfortunately. That's not a valid reason to dislike the Imam, i.e., oh, his voice doesn't sound good. That's a you problem, not the Imam's problem. Because you don't listen to the Quran for the sake of the beautiful sound. You listen to the Quran for what? For the meaning. Or it could be, for example, that he has a corrupt issue in his belief. So he has a problem in his aqidah. What would that look like though? It's not what it is perceived to look like today by many of the young and the young-minded individuals, who anyone who doesn't agree with them in their particular madhab of aqidah, they say this person is a mubtadi'. No, it doesn't work like that. Ahlul Sunnah, i.e. the Hanabala, the Asha'ira, the Maturidiyya, they generally agree in most things. There are a few issues that they disagree in, and anyone who has the aqidah of the Asha'ira or the Hanabala or the Maturidiyya is fit for salah. The issues in aqidah are issues such as issues of i'tizal and issues of extreme irja', issues that relate to the belief system of the Khawarij, and so on and so forth. And in fact, one of the traits of the Khawarij is that they would test a person before they would pray behind him. And that happens today. You have young individuals who will ask the Imam questions. Why? Because they want to make sure that his aqidah is correct before they pray behind him. And if they find that his aqidah is not correct, they won't pray behind him. Just like the Khawarij of the past. And that's not the correct way of Ahlul Sunnah. So the issue of aqidah, that could be a valid reason. And even then, Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, the famous Hanbali scholar and scholar of Islam, some of the Hanabala, they consider him to be someone who reached the level of ijtihad. He mentioned he has a compilation of letters, his responses to some questions that were posed to him, al-Rasail al-Mardiniyya. And someone asked him, can we remove an Imam if he has a problematic framework of theology, i.e. he has problems in his aqidah? And he responded with, if it's going to lead to a greater evil, then you should not do that. Pray behind him and be patient. And so that can generally be said in most cases today. And so there has to be a level of hikmah. Even if a person, let's say for example, has some views that come from the madhab of al-i'tizal, which today does not really exist, or something similar to that, you have patience and you overlook things due to the situation that we find ourselves in today. So then he says, فَكَذَلِكَ يُنْهَى عَنِ التَّقَدُّمِ إِنْ كَانَ وَرَاءَهُ مَنْ هُوَ أَفْقَهُ مِنْهُ. So likewise, he should not put himself forward to lead the prayer of a group who has someone, or who have someone that is more knowledgeable than him amongst them. So if a great alim is in the congregation, it's considered from bad adab, number one, And number two, the salah could potentially be considered invalid by some of the fuqaha if someone who has less knowledge than him puts himself forward in the salah. But there is an exemption to this, to both of these points. And generally to the issues of who should lead and who shouldn't lead, there is an exemption which trumps all of the other conditions. If the imam is al-imam al-ratib, i.e. he's the one who is being paid to lead the salah, then he has right to lead the salah no matter who's praying behind him. And no matter whether the people like him or don't like him. He has the right to lead the salah. Why? Because that's his role and responsibility. But it's still from good adab, good etiquettes, etc. If an alim comes or a sheikh comes or a da'i who is very well known for his knowledge and his da'wah, etc., that person should be offered the position to lead by the imam of the masjid. Then he says, إِلَّا إِذَا امْتَنَعَ مَنْ هُوَ أَوْلَى مِنْهُ فَلَهُ التَّقَدُّمُ. So if a person is amongst a group of, let's say, ulama, mashayikh, talabatu ilm, and they don't put themselves forward and they say, we don't want to lead the salah, then he has a right to put himself forward. And there is in fact times when it may be wajib for a person to put himself forward. If you're in a group of people and you know as a matter of fact that those you're with cannot recite the Quran properly, i.e. their Fatiha is not correct enough for their salah to be valid for themselves, let alone for others, then you should put yourself forward. And that's why it's very important that we at least learn how to recite Fatiha correctly, i.e. tajweed and makharij. And it should be a lifelong struggle, a lifelong journey. So let's say, for example, you're praying somewhere and you look at the people and you assume that most of these people are not going to be able to lead the salah correctly. In that moment in time, it may be recommended, if not wajib, for you to put yourself forward. The problem is though, you cannot judge a person by the way they look. So it can become difficult. But فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. Then he says, وَيُكْرَهُ عِنْدَ ذَلِكَ الْمُدَافَعَةِ. And so I believe what Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he means here is that it becomes disliked to push people out to lead the salah or to argue over the salah, to dispute over who's going to lead the salah, etc. Then he says, الثانية, so the second responsibility or point that should be considered by those who lead the salah, إذا خير المرء بين الأذان والإمامة فينبغي أن يختار الإمامة. So previously we had a discussion, what's better, leading salah or calling the adhan. Imam al-Ghazali, he says, if a person is given the choice between leading salah or calling the adhan, he should choose to lead the salah. Why? He says, لكل واحدة فضلا والإمامة أفضل إذ واظب عليها رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وأبو بكر وعمر والأئمة بعدهم. So he says, each has its virtue. The adhan has its virtue, the salah has its virtue, and they both have their virtues mentioned in various ahadith, etc., etc. But the Prophet ﷺ, he constantly led the salah. Likewise, Abu Bakr did after him. Likewise, Umar did after him. Likewise, the great Imams of Islam did after them, radiallahu ta'ala anhum ajma'een. Therefore, there is more virtue in leading the salah, the imamah. Why? Because it's a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, as he used to lead the Sahaba. Then he says, الثالثة أن يراعي الإمام أوقات الصلوات فيصلي في أوائلها. So prior to coming to this point, now something to consider. Today, we don't have young individuals that say to themselves, I want to grow up and be an imam. It's not looked at as a career choice. And being an imam is not really a career. Being an actual imam, a true imam, is not a career, it's a role. Why? Because it doesn't have a 9 and it doesn't have a 5. It doesn't start in the morning and end in the evening. It's a role. And roles have to be fulfilled. You don't really have to fulfill a job title. But as for roles, they have to be fulfilled. You have to try to do your best to address the role and to adequately take care of the role using the capabilities you have and continue to develop your capabilities, etc. But we don't have young individuals that say to themselves, I want to be an imam. I want to be a talibu ilm, a student of knowledge. I want to be a sheikh, etc. Why? Because perhaps today we are materialistic and we think about the income that comes with roles and positions, rather than thinking about the virtue and the position we might find ourselves with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the akhirah. And if you think about imama, if imama is given its due right, it's the opportunity for great reward with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there is an issue that we're going to address when it comes to imama shortly. So he says, الثالثة أن يراعي الإمام أوقات الصلوات فيصلي في أوائلها ليدرك رضوان الله سبحانه. So he says that the imam should take into consideration and should be cautious and careful to make sure that he prays the prayers on time, particularly the first portion of the times for the prayers, i.e. when Fajr comes in, he prays it in its first portion. Likewise Dhuhr, likewise Asr, likewise Maghrib, likewise Isha, etc. But we have to consider here that Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he was a Shafi'i in his madhab. And so of course this is the Shafi'i perspective. And he's going to discuss it. He says, وَلَا يَنْبَغِي أَن يُؤَخِّرَ الصَّلَاةَ لِانْتِظَارِ كَثْرَةِ الْجَمَاعَةِ. And he should not delay the salah so that the jama'ah can be larger in number. Which is basically a response to who? The Ahnaf. The Ahnaf. Why? Because the Ahnaf, they say that Fajr and Asr should be delayed. Fajr in particular, so that the jama'ah is larger in number, and there are ahadith in relation to this. And Asr, not due to the larger number coming at the later time, but due to the difference of opinion in relation to when does the Asr prayer start. What's the best approach for a person to take, a student of knowledge and imam to take? He follows the timetable that has been followed by his masjid. It is unwise for an imam to come in and try to change the calendar or the time to suit his opinions and his madhab, etc. You follow the madhab of your masjid. And if you would like to change it, discuss it with those who are responsible for the masjid. And things can be changed, etc. But let's say, for example, the masjid is following the Hanafi school, or the masjid is following the Shafi'i school, and you yourself are not following that particular madhab, it's unwise for you to try to change things. And it's especially unwise for you to try to change things in the name of your opinion being correct. Because that understanding itself is incorrect. As all four schools come from the Quran and the Sunnah. All four schools are following the truth. All four schools are valid in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is an ijma' upon this point. There is an ijma' that a person can follow the Hanafi, Shafi'i, or Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, or Hanbali school. There's ijma' on this point. And the only time a person will be questioned for following a madhab is if they reach the stage of ijtihad. If a person reaches such a level of scholarship that they now have the ability to go to the Quran and the Sunnah themselves, and they can select the correct opinions, then they will be questioned by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for following a madhab. But that is at a later stage of scholarship, and very few people make it that far. Why? Because it takes a lot of dedication. You have to dedicate yourself to the study of the Quran with its various modes of recitation, the study of hadith, all of the books of ahadith, the study of the sciences of hadith, i.e. the usul of hadith, the usul of fiqh. You have to know all of the madhabs. You have to know the madhahib outside of the madhabs, and so on and so forth. You have to have a deep understanding of the Arabic language. It takes decades upon decades upon decades. Therefore, if you don't have those skills, and you don't have those tools, and you don't have those qualities, follow a madhab. And you are not going to be held accountable by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for following a madhab. You're not going to be questioned, why did you pray in this way? You're following someone who is considered to be mujma' alayh. There is a consensus upon his scholarship, upon his imamship, upon his leadership, and upon his right to arrive at conclusions and opinions, etc. And from those who mentioned this point in particular, Ibn Rajab, rahimahullah, he has a treatise on the issue of following a madhab. Ibn Hubayra al-Wazir, the famous Hanbali scholar and jurist of his time, he has a commentary on al-Jam' bayna sahihayn, and he comes to the hadith, مَن يُرِدِ اللَّهُ بِهِ خَيْرًا يُفَقِّهُ فِي الدِّينِ, and he mentions there's an ijma' when it comes to following one of the four schools. Then he says, بل عليهم المبادرة لحيازة فضيلة أول الوقت. So rather than delaying the salah, they should try their best to pray the salah on time so that they get the reward of praying in its first time. And again, when it comes to Fajr, this is according to the Shafi'i school. He says, فَهِيَ أَفْضَلْ مِنْ كَثْرَةِ الْجَمَاعَةِ وَمِنْ تَطْوِيلِ السُّورَةِ. Why? As it's more virtuous and better than praying with a larger number and praying with a long amount of recitation. So the greater form of reward in the salah, according to Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah, as is the Shafi'i school, is to pray in the beginning of the time. That's the most virtuous thing you can do. Then, and there's a very famous hadith in relation to that. And the Ahnaf, why do they not take that hadith? Because they say this hadith has to be looked at in relation to the other ahadith in this particular area, etc. We're not going to go into that. Why? Because it's not a fiqh lesson. He says, وَقَدْ تَأَخَّرَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم في صلاة الفجر وكانوا في سفر وإنما تأخر للطهارة فلم ينتظر وقدم عبد الرحمن بن عوف فصلى بهم حتى فاتت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ركعة فقام يقضيها قال فأشفقنا من ذلك فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قد أحسنتم هكذا فافعلوا. So he gives an example of one of the ahadith which are used to suggest the delaying of Fajr. He mentions that the Prophet ﷺ, he delayed Fajr once and they were traveling and he was busy performing his tahara and he was not waited for. Abdurrahman ibn Auf, radiallahu anhu, he put himself forward for the salah and he led the salah. And the Prophet ﷺ, due to being delayed with the tahara, he missed one of the rak'at. So he missed one of the 2 rak'ats of Fajr. And the narrator, he mentions, we felt sorry for the Prophet ﷺ for this. And after, the Prophet ﷺ said, you did the right thing. If it happens again, do that. I.e., put someone forward. But this hadith can be discussed from multiple angles. Not from an authenticity perspective, I mean from the fiqh. As we know, a hadith can be qat'i in its sanad. It can be authentic without a shadow of a doubt in its authenticity. But the nature of the evidence that it presents is up for discussion. And there are many examples of this. So then he says, الرابعة أن يؤم مخلصا لله عز وجل ومؤديا أمانة الله تعالى في طهارته وجميع شروط صلاته. So this is a big point to take into consideration. He says, number one, the Imam should lead the salah with ikhlas. Why? What's going to happen on Yawm al-Qiyamah? The Imam is often, a qari, for example. In many cases, not always, but in many cases, the Imam is a qari, or he's taken by the people as a qari. And for example, people will go to certain masajid to pray behind a certain Imam. So if he's leading salah and he's beautifying his voice and he's not doing it with ikhlas, he's doing it for the people, on Yawm al-Qiyamah, he will be from those that are thrown into the hellfire before everyone else. As the Prophet ﷺ, he said, the first to be thrown into the hellfire is who? The qari. And in a variation of the hadith, the alim. Why? Because he did it for other than Allah. Then he says, وَمُؤَدِّيًا أَمَانَةَ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى فِي طَهَارَتِهِ وَجَمِيعِ شُرُوطِ صَلَاتِهِ. And this is one that is a big, big issue. And one which would potentially put anyone off leading salah. That he has to lead the salah and he is being true to the responsibility given to him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in relation to his tahara and the arkan of the salah. So he knows firstly the arkan of salah, he knows how to correctly perform the tahara and he does so. And unfortunately there may be a case where an imam leads salah without tahara. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us and overlook any of our shortcomings. And so if you are a person who has memorized the Quran, but you have not yet studied fiqh, you should not be leading salah. You have to study at least a book in fiqh, or the fiqh of salah at least. And earlier he said that he should not lead someone who is afqah minhu. Even if a person is a hafidh of the Quran, and he has the most beautiful recitation, but there is someone who has more knowledge than him, of the fiqh of Quran and Sunnah, etc., then that person has more right to lead than the person with beautiful recitation, unless the person has a similar amount of fiqh as this individual, etc. the Quran was sent not for the recitation but for the understanding and application. And this is a very important point to reflect on. Then he says, أما الإخلاص فبأن لا يأخذ عليها أجرة. So now this is a point of contention to discuss. Not contention as in disagreement, but it's a point to reflect on in our time today. He says, as for sincerity, what is a sign of sincerity? That the person doesn't take any money for leading the salah. He's not paid for leading the salah. فقد أمر رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عثمان بن أبي العاص الثقفي وقال اتخذ مؤذنا لا يأخذ على الأذان أجرا أو أجرا. He says that the Prophet ﷺ commanded Uthman to take a mu'adhin from amongst his people that does not take ujra, does not take a payment for performing his adhan. He says, فَالْأَذَانُ طَرِيقٌ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَهِيَ أَوْلَى بِأَنْ لَا يُؤْخَذَ عَلَيْهَا أَجْرٌ. He says, the adhan is what leads to the salah, and if you shouldn't take money for the adhan, then not taking money for the salah is of course even more important. Why? Because the adhan is lesser than the salah. The adhan is for the sake of the salah. So if you shouldn't take money for that which is for the sake of something, you shouldn't take money for the thing itself. And he says, فَإِنْ أَخَذَ رَسْقًا مِنْ مَسْجِدٍ قَدْ وُقِفَ عَلَى مَنْ يَقُومُ بِإِمَامَتِهِ أو من السلطان أو أحد الناس فلا يحكم بتحريمه ولكنه مكروه. He says, if he is given a stipend, a salary, an amount from the masjid, from that which was given to the masjid for the sake of the imam to lead the salah in that masjid, i.e. that becomes his job, أو من السلطان, or from the ruler, أو أحد الناس, or individual people in the community that want to suffice him of working so that he can take care of the position of salah. فلا يحكم بتحريمه ولكنه مكروه. It should not be considered haram, i.e. taking that money, but it's considered disliked. Now, if we think about the imamah in our time today, ideally, every imam does not take money for their position. Ideally, the imam is able to lead the salah and take care of the responsibilities of imamah without taking a single penny or pound. But the reality is, especially in our time today, that's not possible. Why? Because if the imam had to go out and seek provision and work, etc., as well as taking care of the responsibilities and duties of imamah, then there would be no imam, unless the imam is very wealthy. And we see Abu Bakr al-An, they came to him, he was in the marketplace when he was Khalifa, and they asked him, what are you doing? He said, I still have to take care of my family. So they said, we're going to suffice you of this so that you can take care of the responsibilities of the greater imamship, i.e. the khilafah. And he agreed, but he agreed to take only that which suffices him, i.e. that which he can live upon and his family can live upon. That should be the standard for the imam as well. Why? Because in our time today, Imam al-Ghazali, rahmahullah, is perhaps speaking more about the imam, i.e. the imam of salah only, the one who leads the prayer. As for the imam today, the imam in a masjid where there is a big community with many needs, the imam leads salah, the imam provides counseling, the imam provides spiritual guidance, provides mentorship, the imam teaches, the imam rectifies between relationships that have broken and so on and so forth. The imam engages in da'wah activities, the imam engages in outreach activities amongst various groups and communities, etc. And so it's a full-time position. It's a full-time position. And so if we would like the imamship to be carried out properly and for our communities to grow properly, I would suggest, in fact, that the imam, as I said, I'm separating myself here from what I'm saying. Why? Because I'm not talking about Lewisham, I'm not talking about our position here. I'm saying in the UK, the imam should be paid well. Why? Because if you pay well for the imam, you are going to get imams that can carry out the position and the role to a high standard. But if you underpay imams, you are going to get imams that will not carry out the role to a high standard, like any other job. And if you go to many masajid now, the imam cannot speak English, the qira'ah is not on point, They don't have good social skills. Why? Because they're being paid a very low wage. They're being paid a very low wage. And we don't have young, sharp, intelligent minds who say to themselves, I want to contribute what Allah has given me of qualities and skills to my community by being an imam. Why? Because being an imam doesn't pay the bills. And that's something that we need to fix. As someone recently said, and it might sound harsh, but it's a reality. If you pay peanuts, don't complain if you get a monkey. And that's the reality. And if you want a job done well, then pay what should be paid for the job to be done well. And if you really think about it, imams today are carrying out responsibilities that are being carried out by other members of other career communities, and they're being paid nearly 2, 3, 4 times what an imam will be paid. And so it's not about the money. It's about having quality of service. Think about our masajid from a strategical perspective. If the masajid in the UK had competent imams that were able to do their jobs properly and correctly, and they had the skills to do their jobs properly and correctly, then the face of the UK would change. The face of the UK would change. Look at, for example, Lewisham. How many new Muslims come? The services that are offered. People come to Lewisham from all over the UK. No exaggeration. People come to Lewisham from all over the UK for marriage counseling, for mental health related issues, for advice, for guidance, for learning, to become Muslim. Why? Because of the level of work that is being carried out. Why is that possible? Because it's a full-time position. Imamship in Lewisham is a full-time position. It's not something which is seen as a part-time role. You lead the salah, you go home, you come back for the next salah. That's not imamah. And if that's what imamah is going to be, we don't need to pay for imams, because we have plenty of huffaz in our communities. It can become a voluntary position. But if we want to use our masajid properly and strategically, then we need to pay our imams properly. That's reality. And if you have an imam that takes the role seriously, most of the time the imam would wish that he does not have to be paid. Why? So that he can get complete reward. And so for our communities, we have to think about this. And I'm not saying pay the imams so that they're living like superstars. I'm saying pay imams so that they don't have to worry about the bills, they don't have to worry about what's happening at home. They can focus on their job and do their job properly and correctly and give the role what it deserves. Then he says, questions at the end, inshallah. Then he says, وأما الإيمانة أو الأمانة فهي الطهارة باطنا عن الفسق والكبائر والإصرار على الصغائر. So listen now, this again contributes to what we were speaking about earlier about the responsibility and the role. He says the amana, the responsibility of the imam, it's not only in the salah, but there's also a responsibility to apply the deen upon himself correctly. And that's externally and internally. So he says he has to purify himself from fisq and from the larger sins, the greater sins, and from being consistent in carrying out or falling into minor sins. So the imam position, it's not a position that should be taken lightly. It's not. If someone is given a position of an imam, they have to work on themselves and they have to make sure they're not falling into major sins. They're not falling into minor sins consistently, and that they're working on their heart, purifying their heart. Why? He says, فَإِنَّهُ كَالْوَفْدِ وَالشَّفِيعِ لِلْقَوْمِ, because he is like the representative of the community, the spiritual representative of the community. So imagine if a community representative comes and he looks filthy, you're not going to take the community seriously. Likewise, the imam, and the imam is not looked at externally only. He's looked at internally. By who? By Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the impact of his sins is going to have an impact on the community. And if you look through history, those who made a massive change in society, in communities, and so on and so forth, they were individuals that were close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this is something that has to be considered. And it's something that has to be taught as we're teaching our young students of knowledge who are memorizing the Quran, we have to teach them about the internal rectification of the self, about the external application of Islam. Because unfortunately today you find Imams that are falling into not only major sins, but absolutely disgusting and filthy major sins that are too filthy and disgusting to even mention. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us. That's a reality. Likewise, du'at. You find a da'i who's falling into filthy and disgusting actions. Why? Because they haven't worked on themselves. They haven't worked on themselves. And the Prophet ﷺ, for a decade, was working on the Sahaba, their internal rectification, the spiritual rectification in the Meccan period. And in the Meccan period, the external expansion and establishment came, etc. And so this is a point that has to be considered. And it has to be considered by those who are seeking knowledge, those who are put into the positions of imamah, whether they want to be in that position or not. Because sometimes a position is not something you seek, but it's put upon you. If that's the case, you need to fix yourself and work on yourself so that you are fit for the role if you don't see yourself as fit for the role. Then he says, الخامسة he says وكذا الطهارة ظاهرا على الحدث والخبث فإنه لا يطلع عليه سواء. Likewise, the external purification of his body and his ritual purification. He says الخامسة ألا يكبر حتى تستوي الصفوف فليلتفت يمينا وشمالا فإن رأى خللا أمر بالتسوية. That the Imam should not begin the salah, i.e. the tahrima, until the lines are straight. Alhamdulillah, today we have something which suffices us of looking at the lines, etc., which is what? The lines on the floor, on the carpets. So in a masajid where there are lines on the carpets, generally speaking, we line up in straight lines. But that's the Imam's responsibility. Then he says, السادسة أن يرفع صوته بتكبيرة الإحرام وسائر التكبيرات ولا يرفع المأموم صوته إلا بقدر ما يسمع نفسه. So the sixth point is that the Imam should raise his voice loud enough that those who are behind him can hear, i.e. the takbirah, Allahu Akbar, and the takbirat, the following Allahu Akbars, etc., the different adhkar that should be heard by those behind him. He says, وَالْمَأْمُومُ لَا يَرْفَعُ صَوْتَهُ. The one who's being led should not raise his voice. And sometimes you find this in congregations. The Imam says Allahu Akbar, and those behind him, they shout out Allahu Akbar as well, etc. The only exemption to that is if one or two need to relay the takbirah to those that are behind them. For example, on Jum'ah. Then he says, وَلْيُؤَخِّرْ تَكْبِيرَهُ عَنْ تَكْبِيرَةِ الْإِمَامِ فَيَبْتَدِئُ بَعْدَ فَرَاغِهِ. And the person who's being led should delay his takbirah until the Imam has completed his. So he shouldn't do it at the same time. He should do it slightly after the Imam. That's all of the takbirat, according to the Shafi'i and the Hanbali school. According to the Hanafi school, he should try to do it at the same time as the Imam. His takbirat, etc., should correlate with that of the Imam to a degree, to the best of his ability. Then he says, وَظَائِفُ الْقِرَاءَةِ. So the responsibilities or the points to be considered when it comes to recitation. And so we'll stop here, inshallah, and we'll continue next week, بإذن الله. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد.